There is a plaster cast wrapped in a moving blanket in the crawl space beneath my kitchen floor, and I have not unwrapped it in 11 years. My wife believes it is leftover tile from the remodel we did the summer before her mother got sick. I have never corrected her. Every March, when the meltwater comes down off the ridge and the crawl space takes on 4 inches of standing water, I go under the house with a shop vacuum and a headlamp, and I slide that bundle up onto the concrete blocks where it will stay dry, and I do not open it. Then I come back up through the hatch in the pantry, and I wash my hands at the sink for a great deal longer than a person needs to wash their hands. I am going to tell you what is inside that blanket. I am going to tell all of it, from the first radio call to the last night in the hollow. Because Harold Butler is in the ground now, and Jordan Flores is in the ground now. And out of everyone who stood on that shelf of rock above the Hughes River, I am the only one still breathing who is willing to say any part of it out loud. For 19 years I wore the flat hat and the Blue Ridge, and for 14 of those years I ran backcountry patrol in the Central District of Shenandoah National Park. If you have driven Skyline Drive in the third week of October, bumper to bumper with half of Virginia, then you have seen the postcard version of my office. 75 overlooks, more than 500 miles of trail, 101 miles of the Appalachian Trail laid right along the spine of it. Bears grown fat on acorns and entirely unafraid of people. Fog that comes up out of the hollows in the evening the way breath comes out of a mouth. What the postcard does not show you is the other park. Below the ridgeline, off the maintained tread, there are stone chimneys standing alone in the trees with nothing left around them. There are apple trees 80 years old, gone wild and sour, still holding a straight line where somebody planted them in a row. There are family cemeteries with fieldstone markers and no names cut into them. Before this was a park, it was home to something like 500 families, and in the middle of the 1930s, the Commonwealth took the land and moved those families off it, some of them willing, some of them with a deputy standing in the yard. The forest closed over their fields inside of one lifetime. The forest is very good at that. The people who lived in those hollows knew things about that country that never made it into any file I ever read. Hold on to that, it matters later. It began on the 12th of October, and it began the way almost everything in my career began, with a radio that would not stop making noise while I was trying to eat. I was in the truck in the maintenance lot at Big Meadows with a gas station sandwich on my knee, when dispatch put out a call for any unit near the Elk Wallow area. A permit holder had walked out to the trailhead at first light and flagged down a road crew. He was 31 years old, from somewhere outside Baltimore, and he was standing in the parking area in his socks with his phone in his hand, and he would not go back up the trail for his equipment. Not for the tent, not for the sleeping bag, not for the truck keys he had left zipped in the vestibule pocket, which is the only reason he was still standing there at all. Jordan Flores got to him first, because Jordan always got there first. Jordan Flores was 48 years old that autumn, built like a fence post, and had been walking the backcountry of that park since he was 22. He had a way of standing near frightened people that made them stop shaking. I never learned how he did it. He would put one boot up on a rock and lean on his knee and look out at the middle distance instead of at their face, and inside of 2 minutes they would be talking to him like he was family. By the time I came down the fire road, Jordan had the man sitting in the open door of the patrol truck with a wool blanket over his shoulders and a cup of coffee he was not drinking. The man said he had camped about 1.5 miles up, well off the trail, at a legal dispersed site near the run. He said he had gone to sleep around 10. He said that at some point in the night he woke up because 2 rocks were being knocked together. Not thrown, knocked. He was very particular about it. He held up his hands to show us, 2 fists coming together slowly, and he said it went like this. Knock, 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 long pause, knock. He said it came from the slope above him. He said that after a few minutes of it, another set of knocks answered from across the run, lower down, maybe 200 yards off. Then he said something that made Jordan Flores stop writing. He said that whatever was above him started walking a circle around his tent, and that it did not walk like a bear. He had heard bears. He said this walked on 2 legs and it took its time, and it stopped every so often, and when it stopped he could hear it breathing, and the breathing was up high. Not at the level of a dog or a bear at his tent wall. Up around 8 feet, he said. Above his head, on the outside of the nylon. He lay there on his back for 5 hours with his hands over his mouth. When the light came gray enough to see the trees, he unzipped the door and ran, and he did not stop running until his socks were bloody and he was standing on pavement. Jordan closed his notebook. He looked at me, he said, in his ordinary voice, that he would go up and collect the man's gear so we could get him on the road. And did I want to come along? That is how it started. A polite question in a parking lot. The site was where the man said it was, in a flat bench of ground above the run, in a stand of second growth with old fence wire grown into two of the trees. The tent was still standing. Everything inside was as he had left it, which told me right away that this was not a bear and not a person, because a bear would have opened that tent like a bread bag and a person would have taken the truck keys. What I noticed first was the smell. It was not there when we came in from the west, and then we crossed some invisible line and it was there completely, the way you walk into a room where a freezer has failed. It was wet fur and something sweet gone bad underneath it. Jordan stopped walking and put the back of his wrist against his nose and did not say anything. What I noticed second was the ring. There was a circle of disturbed ground around that tent. Not a trail, a circle. The leaf litter was scuffed and turned over in a band about 1.5 feet wide, all the way around, at a radius of maybe 15 feet, and it was closed. It went behind the laurel and came out the other side and joined itself. Whatever made it had walked that ring a great many times, patiently, in the night, in the rain of the day before, without ever once stepping inside it. And in the low ground on the north side of the circle, where the rain had left a lens of soft gray mud and a seep, there were 2 prints. I have looked at track in that park my entire adult life. I have followed bear through mud. I have cast a mountain lion print that turned out to be a large house cat. And I have listened to 2 decades of people telling me that what they saw was definitely not a bear. I know exactly how badly a person wants their track to be something. I am telling you what was in that mud. The first was partial, cut off by a root. The second was complete. It was 19¼ inches from heel to the front of the great toe, and about 8 inches across the ball. There were 5 toes, and they were not the toes of a bear. A bear print puts the little toe on the inside and the big toe on the outside, and it gives you claw marks up front like commas. There were no claw marks. There were 5 toes in a human arrangement, the great toe largest and set slightly apart, and it had pressed deeper than the rest, and it had gripped. You could see the ridge of mud pushed up behind it where it had taken hold on the way through. The heel had sunk 1.25 inches into that seep. Mine, standing next to it in the same mud, went in less than half an inch, and I weighed 205 pounds that year. Jordan Flores crouched down and looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he took off his hat, which was a thing he did in the presence of dead people, and put it back on again like he was embarrassed at himself. He said, quietly, that we were going to need the kid out of the truck. I mixed the plaster on the tailgate with water out of a hydration bladder because the run was 300 yards down a bank, and neither one of us wanted to be alone. I poured it and I waited on it, and the whole time I stood there, I had the feeling that I get maybe 4 times in a life. The one where the skin along the back of your arms tightens up and your body tells you, in a language older than any word you own, that you are being looked at. I never saw anything. The slope above us was in shadow under the hemlocks, and I looked at that slope for 40 minutes, and nothing on it moved. When the cast had set, I lifted it out and wrapped it in a shop rag, and we packed out that man's tent and his sleeping bag and his truck keys, and we went down the mountain. Denise Washington was the district chief that year. She was 54. She had come up through law enforcement in 3 western parks before she took the Blue Ridge, and she had a reputation for being impossible to surprise. I put the cast on the table in the small conference room in the district office, and I peeled the rag back, and I told her exactly what I have just told you, in the flat voice we all use for these things. She stood over it with her arms folded for a long while. Then she asked me who else had seen it. I said Jordan. She asked if either of us had photographed it in place. I said yes, on my phone, and on the district camera. She told me to write the incident as a probable bear encounter with an unidentified track of interest, to file the photographs to the case, and to put the cast in the evidence room and not to carry it around the building. I started to say something. She did not let me get to the end of it. She said that in 19 years of federal service she had learned two things about reports like this one. The first was that they never changed anything. The second was that they followed the person who wrote them for the rest of their career, and they got to the promotion board before that person did. Then she did something I did not expect. She sat down at that table and she asked me, in a completely different voice, whether the circle around the tent had been closed all the way around. I said that it had. Denise Washington nodded slowly, once, and she said, "All right," and she went back to her office and shut the door. I did not understand that until the following June, and by then it was much too late to understand it in a way that helped anybody. Winter came in hard that year, and it swallowed the whole business, the way winter does. Snow closed Skyline Drive at Thornton Gap for most of February. I ran plow escorts and pulled two vehicles out of the ditch below Hazel Mountain, and spent a great deal of time on paperwork. The cast sat on a metal shelf in the evidence room, in a cardboard box with a case number on the lid, and I stopped thinking about it, or I told myself I had. Then in April, the wildlife work started up again, and Alicia Simmons came back to the district. Alicia Simmons was 46, a field technician on the black bear denning study that had been running in that park in one form or another since the 70s. She was not the sort to be impressed by anything. She had crawled headfirst into rock dens with a jab stick to sedate sows in the middle of hibernation while their cubs were awake and complaining, and she had done it more than 100 times. She wore the same faded green fleece for 11 years. She had a laugh that carried across a parking lot. Her study ran a network of about 40 trail cameras across the central district, strapped to trees on game trails and along the old logging grades. She serviced them on a rotation, swapping memory cards and batteries, and she had done it long enough that she knew what normal looked like better than anyone alive. In April, her cameras stopped being normal. She came to my office with a laptop and sat on the corner of the desk and did not make small talk, which was not like her. She said that she was losing cameras, not to bears. Bears chew a camera, or they slap it off the tree and leave a smear of mud and hair, and you find the pieces within a few feet. She was finding her cameras turned around, not knocked down, turned, rotated on the strap so that the lens faced into the bark of the tree it was mounted on, with the strap still buckled and the housing undamaged. She had it happen on 9 cameras between the 1st of April and the middle of May. Every one of them in the drainages on the east side, in the country that runs down toward Nicholson Hollow and the Hughes River. She said something else. She said that on the units where it happened, the last images before the rotation showed nothing at all. No animal, just the trail, at night, in infrared, and then the frame as bark. Except on one. She turned the laptop around. The image was time-stamped at 2:11 in the morning on the 9th of May. The camera was strapped about waist-height on a poplar looking up a game trail. In the middle distance, maybe 30 feet out, the trail runs between 2 rock outcrops and there is a gap of open ground. Something was crossing that gap, and it was cut off at the shoulders by the top edge of the frame. You could see 2 legs and a trunk. You could see the whole thing from the waist down, and the legs were not proportioned like a bear standing up, because a bear standing up has short legs and a long body, and it is unmistakable to anybody who has seen it. These were long. The knee was high, and the shin was long, and there was a heavy muscling in the thigh that the infrared picked up as a bright plate. It was mid-stride, and it was not looking at the camera, because whatever was above the top of that frame was above the top of that frame, and the camera was mounted at 42 inches. Alicia Simmons said that she had measured the outcrops in the background with a rangefinder and run the math 3 times. She said whatever crossed that trail was between 8 feet 2 and 8 feet 9 inches tall. I asked her who else had seen the image. She said nobody. I asked her what she intended to do with it. She said she had already decided. She was going to say nothing to anyone at the university because she wanted to work again the following year. And she was going to keep servicing her cameras and keep her mouth shut, and she was going to move 6 units into the upper hollow to see what she could get. Then she asked me, in an odd voice, whether it was true that there was a cast in the evidence room. That is how these things move through an agency. Never in a report. Always sideways, in a doorway, at the end of a shift. I am going to pause here for a moment, because everything after this stops being about strange photographs and starts being about people who did not come home. If you have stayed with me this far, take 1 second and press the like button, and leave me a comment telling me the name of the woods you grew up next to, because every single one of you has a place like that, and I want to read them. Subscribe if you want to hear the rest of what happened in that hollow, and then stay with me, because the 17th of June is where all of this turned. On the 17th of June, a car was reported sitting overnight at the trailhead lot at the end of the Nicholson Hollow Road, and had been there 3 days. It belonged to a 26-year-old man from Charlottesville who had told his sister he was doing a 4-day loop. He was experienced. He had done the Appalachian Trail in Maine, and he had done it in winter. He had a permit on the dash, filled out correctly, with his itinerary written in small, neat capital letters. He had planned 3 nights, and his last night was to be up near the old Corbin place, and his sister had been unable to reach him since the 14th. Denise Washington took incident command out of the lot below the hollow, and she ran it by the book, and she ran it well. We had the county on scene by noon and a dog team out of the valley by 2. We had a helicopter out of the state police by the following morning. We ran hasty teams on the trails. We ran grid on the likely drainages. We checked the shelters and the huts and the water sources. We ran that search for 11 days. On the 2nd day, the dog team quit. I want to be precise about that, because it is the part that people always shorten when they tell it back to me. The dogs did not fail to find a scent. The handler was a retired county deputy who had worked cadaver and trailing dogs for 20 years and had a bloodhound named Sadie that had found 4 people in that valley. Sadie took the scent article at the vehicle, and she worked the lot, and she started up the trail with real intention, tail going, all business. At about 4/10 of a mile, she stopped in the middle of the trail. She would not go forward. She sat down in the tread and she turned her body sideways so that she was facing back down the mountain, and she began to whine in a way the handler told me later he had heard exactly twice, both times near a fresh body of water where a person had drowned. He tried to work her past it 3 times. On the 3rd attempt, she voided herself in the trail and pulled backward out of her harness, which is a thing that dog had never done in her life, and she ran 200 yards down the mountain and got under the truck. The handler was a hard man, and he was not embarrassed. He came and found me at the command post, and he said, plainly, that whatever was up that hollow, his dog was telling him it was not a dead man, and he was not going to keep pushing an animal that was trying to save his life. Then he loaded up, and he left. On the 6th day, one of my hasty teams found the boot. It was in the Hughes River drainage, upstream of the crossing, in a laurel hell on the north side, where nobody would walk on purpose. It was a right boot, a well-used trail runner, size 11, matching the description his sister had given us. It was laced. That is the detail that will not leave me. The laces were still tied in a double knot, and the tongue was still centered, and the collar of it was not stretched or torn. There was no blood in it, no tissue, no sock. It had simply been removed from a foot in a manner that did not disturb the lacing at all, which is a thing I could not do to my own boot with 2 hands in 10 minutes. It was sitting upright on a flat rock, sole down, pointing up the drainage. I stood over it with the team leader, a seasonal in his 2nd summer, and he asked me if maybe an animal had carried it there. And I said yes, probably. And he looked at me and I looked at him, and both of us knew what a laced boot standing square on a rock looks like, and neither one of us was going to be the one to say it out loud on an open channel. We searched 5 more days. We found nothing else. Not a pack, not a pole, not a scrap of fabric, not a bone. On the 11th day, Denise Washington suspended active operations and moved it to limited continuous, which is what we say instead of saying that we are done. The sister stood in that parking lot and screamed at her, and Denise Washington stood there and took every word of it with her hands folded in front of her and did not defend herself once. Afterward, she walked back to the tent and sat down and looked at the map on the easel for a long while. Then she said, to no one in particular, that she wanted the boundary landowners canvassed again. All of them, including the ones on the far side of the ridge. And she said one name in particular. She said, "Get me Harold Butler." Harold Butler was 62 years old, and he lived on 11 acres of hillside outside Etlin, on the east side, where the last county road gives up and the boundary of the park comes down almost to the mailboxes. He had an orchard of about 90 trees, mostly old varieties nobody sells anymore, and a shop where he rebuilt small engines for people who paid him in venison and firewood as often as in money. He was a widower. He had a hound named Preacher who was too old to hunt and slept on a car seat on the porch. He was also the grandson of a woman named Ada Butler, who was born in Nicholson Hollow in 1899 and was taken out of it in 1935, at the age of 36, with 4 children and a cook stove in the back of a state truck. I did not know any of that when I drove out there. I knew that his name was on the boundary landowner list, and that a note in the file from 6 years earlier said that he was cooperative but did not care for the Park Service, which is a sentence that appears next to a great many names on that side of the ridge and is entirely earned. He was at the shop bench when I came up the drive. He looked at the truck, and he looked at the arrowhead patch on my sleeve, and he wiped his hands on a rag and did not offer one of them to me. I told him a young man was missing up the hollow. I told him the date, and the trailhead, and where the boot was found. I asked him what everybody gets asked. Had he seen anyone unusual, any vehicle, anything at all? Harold Butler looked past my shoulder at the ridge for a while. Then he asked me what month the tracks were in. I had not said one word about tracks. I stood there in that gravel drive, and I felt the day tilt slightly. I said, "October." He nodded like a man having a suspicion confirmed that he had very much hoped would not be. He said, "Then it will be June or July when it is finished, and then it will be quiet a good while." He put the rag down on the bench, and he told me to come sit on the porch, because he was not going to say the rest of it standing in a driveway with a federal truck running behind him. I have gone over what he told me on that porch more times than I have gone over anything else in my life, and I am going to give it to you the way he gave it to me, without arranging it into something tidier than it was. He said that his grandmother Ada was born up the Hughes River, above where the Corbin place stands now, and that there were 9 families in that hollow when she was a girl, and that they had a name for the thing that lived above them on the shoulder of the mountain, in the rock, in the country that is too steep and too laurel-choked for a person to have any business in. They called it the Old Tenant. He said his grandmother was very particular about the word. It was not a joke, and it was not a story for children. A tenant is somebody who lives on the land and pays for it and has a right to be there. And the point of the word, the whole point of it, was that the old tenant had been on that mountain before the Butlers were and would be on it after, and that the arrangement between them was not friendship and it was not war. It was an arrangement. It had terms. The terms, as he had them from her, were these. You did not go above the second bench in the upper hollow. There is a break in the slope up there where the ground steps back before the cliffs, and above that break the families did not cut timber, did not run stock, did not hunt, and did not go. Not to look for a lost cow, not to look for anything. You put something out at the stone. There was a flat-topped boulder at the edge of their upper field, and every family in that hollow put something on it at the change of the seasons. Salt, a shoulder of hog, cornmeal in a cloth, apples in the fall, which is why his people planted the orchard where they planted it. Ada Butler did it her whole life, and after they moved her off the mountain she did it at the edge of the new place too, on a rock her son carried down for her in a wagon. And Harold Butler had done it every year of his adult life, and he pointed with 2 fingers, and there it was, a flat gray stone at the top of his orchard, with a coffee can and a scattering of apples on it. And you did not answer it. That one, he said twice. He said, "If you hear knocking, you do not knock back. If you hear whistling, you do not whistle back. If you hear a woman calling your name in the woods at night, and there is no woman on that mountain, you do not answer, and you do not go, and you do not tell yourself that it is your sister or your wife or your child, because it is not, and it knows what your child sounds like because it has been listening to your child for longer than you have been alive." He said his grandmother lost a brother to that. 1912, 9 years old. Went out the door after somebody calling him from the tree line in his mother's voice while his mother was standing at the stove. They found his coat, folded, on a rock in the creek 4 days later. Folded, he said. Not thrown. Folded. I asked him the question you are asking right now. I asked him why anybody would stay on a mountain like that. Harold Butler laughed at me. It was not a mean laugh. He said, "Where do you think people go?" Then he said the thing that I have never been able to get out from under. He said that it was not really a monster to them. It was weather. It was a bad neighbor with a rifle and a temper and a deed older than yours. You did not fight the weather. You did not report the weather. You built your house facing away from it, and you kept your children in at the right times of the year, and you got on with your life. And the arrangement held for 100 years and more, and nobody up that hollow ever thought it was remarkable. And then in 1935 the government came and took every single family off that mountain in the space of 2 seasons. And nobody, he said, ever went back up to the stone. He looked at me then, and he asked me if I understood what that meant. I said I did not. He said, "You took away everybody who knew the rules, and you put a trail through it, and you have been sending strangers up there in the hundreds of thousands every year for 90 years, and not one of them has ever left so much as an apple." We sat there on that porch a while. Preacher the Hound got up, turned around twice, and lay back down. Then Harold Butler said that he would take me up to the second bench, and to the stone, and show me the ground, on 3 conditions. That we went in daylight and came out in daylight. That I brought no more than 3 people. And that I did not bring a firearm up past the bench. I told him the last one was not possible. I was a commissioned officer, and I did not have the discretion to leave my sidearm in a truck. He thought about that, and he said, "Then keep it on you, and keep your hand off it, because the one thing his grandmother said would break the arrangement faster than anything on this earth was to put a wound in it." And the reason nobody in that hollow ever put a wound in it was not that they could not, because those were people who shot everything that walked, and the reason was that it had happened once, in her mother's time, and everybody in the hollow had spent an entire winter with the doors barred and their animals dying, and after that it was simply not done. I went back to the district office, and I sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes before I went in. Then I did the only thing I could do with any of that. I told Denise Washington a version of it with the folklore sanded off. I told her that a boundary landowner with generational knowledge of the upper hollow had offered to walk us into terrain we had not covered, terrain that was above the search grid, and that he described it as a place local families had historically avoided, which was every word of it true. She approved it in about 4 seconds, which told me a great deal about what she already believed and would not say. We went in on the 29th of June. Harold Butler, Jordan Flores, Alicia Simmons, and me. Alicia came because she wanted to hang cameras and because I wanted somebody along who measured things for a living. And that afternoon, at about 4 in the evening, standing on the second bench with the light coming sideways through the trees, we heard a child crying. It came from up the slope, above us, from the rock. It was not close, and it was not far. It rose and it fell, and it caught and hitched the way a real child does when it has been crying long enough to be tired. Alicia Simmons took 2 steps toward it before she knew she had done it. I watched her do it. I watched her face while she did it, and there was nothing on it but simple decency, the plain reflex of a grown woman hearing a small child in trouble. Harold Butler took hold of her pack strap from behind and did not let go, and he said, in a completely level voice, without raising it at all, "Do not." The crying went on for 11 minutes. I know it was 11 minutes because Alicia looked at her watch when it started, and I looked at mine when it stopped. And I have that page of my field notebook still. Then it stopped in the middle of a breath. Not fading, stopping, like a hand had come down on a record. And about 40 seconds later, from the same place, a woman's voice said a name. It was not a name any of the 4 of us had. I want to be clear about that. It was not my name. It was not Jordan's. It was not Alicia's. It was not Harold's. It was a name none of us knew, said clear and close and warm, the way you would say it across a kitchen. Harold Butler went absolutely gray. Jordan Flores asked him what it was, and Harold Butler said, That was my grandmother's voice, and that was her brother's name. We should have gone down the mountain right then. I have written that sentence in my head about 9,000 times. Here is why we did not, and I am not going to dress it up. We had a missing man. We were 8 days past the point where anybody expected to find him alive, and I had spent 11 days looking at his sister in a parking lot. Above the bench was the only ground in that entire drainage that had never been searched by anybody, ever, and I was standing on the edge of it with the only living person who knew how to walk it. So I made a decision, and the decision was that we would come back with the equipment to do it properly, and that we would come back before the weather turned, and that we would stay a night on the bench with lights and cameras and thermal and do the thing right. Denise Washington approved that too, but she approved it with a condition of her own, and the condition was that she was coming. We went in on the 6th of July with 5 people and about 400 pounds of equipment between us. We set the camp on the bench itself, in a flat spot below a rock face, with the cliffs at our back so that nothing could come at us from above without coming down the face. Alicia Simmons put out 8 cameras on a ring at 50 yards, all of them facing outward, all of them on fresh cards and lithium cells. She set 2 more looking directly into camp. Jordan Flores ran a perimeter of fishing line at ankle height with sinkers strung on it, an old poacher trick, so that anything crossing it would rattle and we would know the direction. I had a thermal monocular signed out of the district that was worth more than my truck. Harold Butler carried a 5-gallon bucket up that mountain with 2 hams in it, and a sack of cornmeal, and a paper bag of apples out of the cellar. He walked out to the stone alone before the light went. We could see him from camp, maybe 80 yards up, at the edge of where the old field had been, standing at that flat rock with his hat off. He was up there about 10 minutes. I could not hear whether he was speaking. When he came back, he did not say anything about it, and nobody asked him. Denise Washington and I took the first watch. It started at 9:41. The first thing was a single knock, up the slope, deadwood on deadwood, hard enough to carry. Nobody in that camp said a word. Alicia Simmons set her coffee down on a rock with both hands like it was full to the brim. Then there were 2 knocks from the northeast, down the bench, 400 yards off at least. Then 2 more from almost directly behind the rock face at our backs, which was not possible, because there were 60 feet of vertical stone there. Harold Butler said, quietly, that there was more than one of them, and that there had always been more than one of them, and that his grandmother said you never saw more than one at a time, and you were never dealing with only one. At 10:20 the rocks started coming in. They came in high, on a long arc, and they landed inside camp. Not at us, around us. Stones the size of a fist and larger, thrown from somewhere out in the black where the thermal showed me nothing but the cold trunks of trees and the warm scatter of a raccoon 200 feet out. Whatever was throwing them from beyond the range of my light and putting them down within 10 feet of the fire ring, over and over, for about 40 minutes. I want to explain what that does to a person, because a rock landing near you does not sound like much when you say it out loud. It is the accuracy, it is understanding, one stone at a time, that something you cannot see and cannot hear moving can put an object exactly where it wants to put it, in the middle of the night, at a distance you cannot even measure, and that every single one of those stones is a sentence, and the sentence is, I could have. At 11:10 the fishing line on the west side went off. Jordan Flores had it laid so we would know direction, and it rattled once, sharply, and then the entire line came up out of the leaves and went taut, and the sinkers all rang together, and then it went slack. Something had taken hold of that line, lifted it, and set it down. At 11:40, the smell came into camp, the same smell from the tent site in October. Wet fur and sweet rot, so thick that Alicia Simmons put her face into the crook of her elbow and kept it there. And then it walked past us. I saw it in thermal at a range I later paced at 61 yards, moving left to right along the outside of the camera ring, and I had it in the glass for about 4 seconds. It was upright, and it did not bob. That is the thing nobody tells you. A person walking through rough ground at night bobs and stumbles and puts a hand out. A bear rocks. This came along that slope in a straight level line at a speed that was not a run and was not a walk. and its head stayed at exactly one height the entire way, the way a rifle scope stays on a target while the body underneath it does the work. In the thermal, it was a solid white shape, and it filled more of that field of view than a person had any business filling at 60 yards. The arms hung long, and they swung with the stride, and there was a mass across the shoulders that made the head look small and low and set forward. And as it went behind a poplar and came out the other side, it turned its head, without breaking stride, and it looked at us. I saw the two flat spots where the eyes were, cold against the white of the face. Then it went into a stand of hemlock, and the thermal gave me nothing, and I lowered the glass, and I found that I had been holding my breath for so long that, when I let it go, I made a sound. And Denise Washington put her hand on my shoulder and gripped hard, and neither of us ever spoke about that hand. Jordan Flores said, into the quiet, that he was going to get the other thermal out of his pack. He went 11 feet from that fire to his pack, which was leaned against the base of a birch at the edge of camp, and something took him off his feet. There was no warning and no noise before it. There was the sound of Jordan Flores hitting the ground, and a crash of Laurel going away downhill fast and heavy, and Jordan yelling one word, which was not a word, and then Alicia Simmons screaming his name, and 5 headlamps swinging at once. He was on his back 8 feet down the slope with his knee bent the wrong way, and a tear in his shirt from the collar to the hip. There was nothing on the slope below him, nothing on the thermal, nothing at all. His pack was gone. We never found it. We did not go anywhere that night. Jordan Flores had a dislocated knee and a spiral of bruising up his ribs and a set of 4 parallel abrasions across his chest that had gone through a shirt and a base layer without breaking skin in a single place, which is a thing I still cannot make sense of. He could not walk. Carrying a 200-pound man off a laurel-choked slope in the black requires 6 people in daylight, and we had 4 people in neither. So we did what you do. We built the fire up. We put him in a bag. We got fluids in him, and Denise Washington sat with her back against a rock with a shotgun across her knees and did not close her eyes one time. Nothing else came in, not a knock, not a stone. The smell thinned out sometime after 1 in the morning and did not come back. Whatever had been out there had made its point, and it had gone about its business, and the woods around us went so completely quiet that I could hear the Hughes River 400 vertical feet below us, which I had not been able to hear all evening. At first light I called it in, and Denise arranged a carry-out team from the valley to meet us at the crossing at noon. And at first light we also saw the tree. It was a hemlock about 130 yards northeast of camp, on the far side of the ring of cameras, and hanging in the crotch of it, at a height Alicia Simmons later put at 38 feet, was a green internal frame pack. There is no way to climb a hemlock. The branches start high, and they will not hold a person. There was no rope, no scuff, no bark damage on the trunk at all. It was the missing man's pack. His permit copy was still in the lid pocket, in his small, neat capitals. We had until noon. I told Denise Washington that I was going above the bench. She did not argue with me, and she did not order me not to. And I have thought about that a great deal since. What she said was that she was staying with Jordan, and that I had until 11 o'clock, and that if I was not on the radio every 10 minutes she was going to burn the entire mountain down with people and helicopters, and there would be nothing left of my career or hers. Harold Butler came. Alicia Simmons came, with a camera and a rangefinder, because she said if she went home without a measurement she would spend the rest of her life not believing herself. Above the second bench the ground goes to pieces. It steps up in ledges through rhododendron so thick you go through it on your hands and elbows for 30 and 40 yards at a stretch. And then it opens under the cliffs into a strip of ground maybe 40 feet wide that runs along the base of the rock for a quarter mile. There is no trail. There has never been a trail. It is the most enclosed piece of country I have ever been in. And the strange thing, the thing I noticed inside of 5 minutes, was that it was clean. Open under the overhang, packed ground, no blowdown, no litter of branches. It looked swept. We found the bones at about 8:30. They were under the deepest part of the overhang, stacked. That is the only word for it. Long bones laid parallel, dozens of them, deer mostly, some bear, and set upright against the rock behind them were skulls, not arranged in a pattern, arranged the way a man stacks firewood, because a stack is easier than a pile. And I have never been able to decide which explanation frightens me more. Alicia Simmons photographed all of it, and she did not say one word the entire time. And past the bone stack, where the overhang narrows into a vertical cleft in the rock about 18 inches wide, Harold Butler stopped and held up his hand and said, "There." The missing man was in that cleft. He was alive. He had been missing 23 days. He was down somewhere near 30 pounds. He was wedged in there facing outward with his knees up under his chin, wearing one trail runner, and his hair at the temples had gone white, and he was awake, and his eyes tracked us the whole time we were getting to him. He did not make a sound. Not when we reached him, not when we got him out, not when we straightened his legs, which must have hurt more than I can imagine. He opened his mouth, and the muscles of his throat worked, and nothing came out of him at all. He has never made a sound since. I want to be precise, because the newspapers got it wrong. He is not mute in the medical sense. His throat is undamaged. Every specialist who has examined him in 11 years has said his voice should work. It does not. He writes, and he lives with his sister, and he has an ordinary life in most respects. And one time, years later, at a hearing, a lawyer asked him in writing what happened up there, and he wrote 4 words on the pad and handed it back. He wrote, "It kept calling me." We got him down to the bench by 10:40. The carry-out team met us at the crossing. There were 2 litters going down that mountain that afternoon, and the whole way down I kept counting heads, and every time I counted I got the same number, and every time I counted I told myself I would look up in a minute and see him behind us. Harold Butler did not come down. He walked with us as far as the stone at the top of the old field. He had left the bucket up there the night before. He stopped, and he took the sack of cornmeal off his shoulder, and he told me to get that boy to the road. I told him to come with us, he said, in the same level voice he used when he took hold of Alicia's packstrap, that somebody had been taking from that mountain for 90 years, and nobody had put anything back, and that it was owed something, and that he was the last one alive who knew what it was owed. I said something. I do not remember what. I remember that I put my hand on his arm, and that he took it off, politely, the way you move a branch out of a doorway. And then Harold Butler walked up past the stone toward the rock with a sack of meal on his shoulder, and he was talking as he went. Not shouting, talking, in a conversational voice, in a rhythm that sounded to me like somebody saying a name and then explaining themselves. And I stood there in the wet grass of a field that has not been a field since 1935, and I listened to a man have a conversation with a mountain until the laurel closed behind him. We searched for him for 9 days. We had the helicopter and the dogs and 80 people and every resource the agency could put on a hillside, and I personally went back up onto that shelf 4 times, and the bones were still stacked there, and the ground was still swept, and there was no trace of Harold Butler, and there never has been. The bucket was on the stone. The cornmeal was gone out of the sack, and the sack was folded. Folded, in quarters, with the corners square. The official record says the following. It says that a 26-year-old man became disoriented in the Hughes River drainage, sheltered in a rock feature, and was recovered alive on the 7th of July, suffering from exposure, dehydration, and a psychogenic loss of speech. It says that a park employee sustained a knee injury during a night operation, cause listed as a fall on uneven terrain and low light. It says that a 62-year-old male volunteer participating in a search became separated from his party in dense terrain and is presumed deceased, remains not recovered. Every line of that is technically true, and all of it together is a lie, and I signed 2 of those documents myself. Alicia Simmons pulled her cards on the 9th of July. 6 of the 8 cameras on the outer ring had been rotated on their straps to face the trunks of their own trees, with the buckles still fastened. Of the 2 cameras looking into camp, one had a full card of nothing. The other had 4 frames between 11:38 and 11:39 at night, all of them white, all of them overexposed by something passing within 4 feet of the lens. In the last of those 4 frames, at the very edge of the blown-out white, there is a hand. I have looked at that frame for 11 years, and I can tell you it is a hand, and I can tell you the fingers are wrong, too long between the joints, and the palm is not a palm shape, and the skin over the back of it is loose and folded like the skin over the back of an old elephant, and there is hair growing out of it in a whorl. Alicia Simmons has never published it. She left field work 3 seasons later and went into environmental compliance for a utility company and makes a great deal more money and does not answer emails about that summer. I do not blame her. She sent me a copy of the file once, in the mail, on a disc, with no note in the envelope. Jordan Flores never came back to the backcountry. His knee took 2 surgeries and never came right, and he finished his career at an entrance station and took medical retirement at 52. And he died 4 years ago in his kitchen of a heart that quit without asking anybody. At his service, his wife took me aside and told me that he never slept a full night after that July, not one, and that he kept a light on the porch until the morning he died, and that he never once explained it to her. Denise Washington retired the following spring. On her last afternoon, she came and found me in the office, and she put a cardboard box on my desk with a case number on the lid, and she said that the evidence room was being inventoried, and that a plaster cast of an unidentified track from an unfounded incident was going to be destroyed as part of routine disposal. Then she stood there and looked at me until I picked it up. At the door she stopped and she said one thing more. She said that when she was 26 years old, working a district out west, she had spent a night in a fire lookout, listening to something walk a closed circle around the base of the tower. She said she had never told a single soul in 32 years, and that she was not telling me now either, and she went out and got in her car. That is why she asked me about the circle. That is the only answer I ever got about that. I retired 8 years ago. I bought 11 acres outside Etlin from Harold Butler's daughter, because she lived in Ohio and did not want it, and because I could not stand the idea of somebody putting a vacation rental on it. The orchard is 90 trees of old varieties, and I have learned to keep about 60 of them alive. Preacher the hound is buried under the biggest one. My wife loves it out here. She says the air is different. At the top of the orchard there is a flat gray stone that a man carried down off a mountain in a wagon 100 years ago for his mother. Every year at the end of October I put apples on it, 2 bushels. I put a block of salt beside them, and I put a bag of meal, and I do it in the daylight, and I take my hat off, and I do not stay. In the spring the stone is bare and clean, and the sack is folded. I have never seen anything from this house. I want to be honest about that, because I do not want to sell you something I do not have. In 8 years I have seen nothing. But twice, in the fall, late, sitting on that porch with the lights off, I have heard a single knock come down off the ridge, deadwood on deadwood, hard enough to carry across 2 hollows. And both times I have sat there with my hands flat on my knees, and I have not answered it, because I know the rules now. Harold Butler paid a great deal to teach them to me, and I am not going to waste it. If you have stayed with me all the way to the end of this, do me one favor and hit the like button, and subscribe so that you are here for the next one, because there are 3 more incidents from that district that I have never told anyone, including my wife. And in the comments I want to know one thing from you. If you were on that bench and you heard a child crying up in the rock at 4 in the evening, would you have taken those 2 steps toward it the way Alicia Simmons did? Be honest with me, because I have been telling myself for 11 years that I would not have, and I am no longer certain that is true. There is a plaster cast wrapped in a moving blanket in the crawl space beneath my kitchen floor. 19 1/4 inches, heel to toe. I still have not opened it. The boot came out of the culvert first. It was a size 11. Brown leather gone almost black with water. The heel worn down to a slant on the outside edge, the way a heavy man wears down a heel. The laces were still knotted twice, the way a careful person knots them when he expects a long day of walking and does not want to stop. I pulled it free of the gravel with a gloved hand and held it up to the gray light, and the water ran out of it in a thin thread and made a stain on the shoulder of Skyline Drive at mile 51.3. 9 years in this park, and I have pulled a great many things out of culverts. Beer cans, a car battery, a folding chair, once a wedding dress, still in its garment bag, zipped, which I have never stopped thinking about. A single boot is not remarkable. Hikers lose gear. Bears drag packs down slopes and tear them open and leave what does not smell like food. Water moves things a long way in this terrain, and it moves them fast. But the sock was still in the boot. And the sock was still laced inside the boot, which means the boot had come off a foot without the laces being loosened, and I have been doing this work long enough to know exactly how much force that requires. I keyed the radio on my shoulder. Central, this is Unit 411. I am at mile 51.3, North Shoulder, Culvert Outflow. I have a single item of personal gear that I want logged. Advise if we have any overdue party reports in the Hawksbill or Rock Spring area. The reply came back thin and scratchy the way it always does on the ridge, where the mountains bounce a signal around like a coin in a jar. 411, Central, stand by. I set the boot on the tailgate of the truck and took my photographs. Overview, mid-range, detail with a scale card, 12 photographs. Then I bagged it and wrote the tag out with a paint marker, date, time, location, my initials, and I logged it in the vehicle book. That is the work. People imagine that a park ranger spends his days pointing at waterfalls, and there are days like that, and they are good days. But most of the work is paper. Most of the work is writing down exactly what you saw at exactly what time, because in 3 months a lawyer or a family or a review board will ask you, and the only honest answer is the one you wrote down before you had time to build a story around it. Central came back at 7:42 in the morning. 411 Central. Affirmative on an overdue party. Backcountry permit issued 26th of October. 5-person group. Entry at White Oak Canyon lower lot. Planned exit 29th. Today is the 30th. Vehicle still in the lot. Family made contact with us at 0500. I stood on the shoulder with my hand on the tailgate and looked out east across the layered ridges of the Blue Ridge in the last of the fog. All that folded old rock going blue and then bluer and then simply gone, and I felt the day change under me, the way a floor changes when you step from wood onto ice. Central, 411, copy. Send me the permit. The names came through the terminal in the truck a few minutes later. Tiffany Hughes, 41, of Charlottesville. Jordan Flores, 48, of Richmond. Denise Washington, 54, of Silver Spring. Harold Butler, 62, of Front Royal. Alicia Simmons, 46, of Baltimore. 5 adults, all experienced, according to the permit notes. Butler had been in the park more than 100 times by his own count on the form, and the ranger who issued the permit had written a small note in the comment field, which almost never happens. The note said that Butler had asked whether the Nicholson Hollow closure was still in effect, and had seemed disappointed to hear that it was not a closure at all, only a bridge out. That detail sat in my chest wrong, and I did not know why yet. I want to say something about Shenandoah before I tell you the rest, because if you do not understand the ground, you will not understand what happened on it. People look at this park on a map and they see a long, thin ribbon along the spine of the Blue Ridge, 79 miles of road with a green band on either side, and they think it is a small park. It is not a small park. It is roughly 200,000 acres, and about 80% of that is recommended wilderness, and the shape of it is the thing that fools you. The park is narrow, so you are never more than a few miles from a road as the crow flies. But nothing here goes as the crow flies. The hollows run down off the ridge like the fingers of a hand, steep and choked and full of rhododendron so thick that a grown man can force his way into it and be invisible from 20 feet in any direction. Laurel Hells, the old families called them. You can be 400 yards from Skyline Drive and be as lost as a person can be. And the park was not empty before it was a park. That is the part visitors never think about. In the 1930s, the Commonwealth of Virginia condemned this land and moved out around 500 families who had lived in these hollows for generations. Their homes came down. Their orchards went feral. Their cemeteries are still up here, most of them, small stone teeth in the leaf litter, and their roads are still up here too, worn into the ground so deep that in some places you walk in a trench up to your waist and do not realize you are walking on a road that carried wagons before your grandfather was born. The forest grew back over all of it. But the ground remembers, and there are places in this park where the ground remembers more than I am comfortable with. I drove down off the ridge to the White Oak Canyon lower lot and found the vehicle, a gray Honda Pilot with Maryland plates, 3 days of oak leaves on the hood and pollen dust turned to mud on the windshield by 2 nights of dew. Nothing inside but a phone charger, an empty travel mug, and a paperback face down on the passenger seat with the spine broken. Jordan Flores had left a note under the wiper blade. It was written on the back of a gas station receipt in blue ink, and the rain had gotten into the top of it. Out wed, back fry afternoon. If this is still here sat, we went the long way. Underneath, in different handwriting, smaller and pressed harder into the paper. We did not. I read that twice, then a third time, then I photographed it in place before I touched it, because that is the work. The second line was not there when the note was written. The ink was different. The paper had been folded and unfolded, and whoever wrote the second line had come back to this parking lot, which is 4.5 trail miles and about 2,000 feet of elevation below where that permit said they were supposed to be, and they had written 2 words on a receipt, and then they had gone back up. I called it in and requested a search management team, and by 10 in the morning there were 11 of us in the lot, and by 2 in the afternoon there were 43, and by the following morning there were more than 160, including a dog team out of Rockingham County and a helicopter from the state police that flew the canyon 4 times and found nothing at all but a great deal of yellow and orange forest. I have been on 11 full searches in this park. I want to be clear about the ones that end well, because they mostly do. People walk out. People get found sitting on a rock, embarrassed, out of water, apologizing. Twice I have carried somebody out on a litter and heard them make a joke about it on the way down. This one did not go like that. We found Tiffany Hughes on the second morning of the search. She was not lost. That is the first thing to understand. She was 3/4 of a mile from the Limberlost Trail, sitting on a downed chestnut oak with her back to the trail and her face to the woods, and she was completely dry, and her pack was on her back with both straps done up, and her water bladder was full. A search team walked within 40 feet of her at 6:10 in the morning and did not see her. I found her at 6:35 because I heard her breathing. I want to say that again, because in the report I had to write it in the flat language they require, and the flat language does not carry it. I found a living adult woman in daylight, on open ground under mature timber, because I heard her breathing before I saw her. She was that still. She did not turn when I said her name. I came around slowly into her field of view with my hands where she could see them, and I crouched down about 8 feet away, and I said her name again. Tiffany Hughes. My name is on this shirt if you want to check it. I am with the park. You have been reported overdue, and there are a lot of people out here looking for you, and I would like to tell them you are all right. Are you hurt anywhere? She said, and I wrote this in my notebook within 90 seconds of her saying it because I knew I would want it exactly, she said. Is it still standing in the trees behind me? Not a question. She did not put a question in her voice. She said it the way you say a thing you have already said many times. I looked past her shoulder. There was nothing behind her but 40 yards of open oak and hickory with the light coming through it in long slants and the leaves coming down one at a time in that unhurried way they come down in the last week of October. I could see 200 feet in that direction. There was nothing there. There is nothing behind you, I said. I am looking right now. There is nothing there. I am going to come a little closer. She let out a breath that had been in her for a long time, and her shoulders came down about 2 inches, and she began to shake. And then she cried, and I let her, and I put my jacket over her shoulders and radioed our position and asked for a slow approach, no shouting, 1 person at a time, because I did not like what her body was doing. Her vitals were within normal limits. She was mildly dehydrated, and she had 2 contusions on her left forearm, one of which showed a curved edge that the examiner later described in a way I will get to. She had not eaten in roughly 40 hours. Her boots were on the wrong feet. She had not noticed that. When I pointed it out, she looked down at them for a long time, and then said that she had put them on in a hurry. The interview happened in stages over 2 days. I sat in on all of it because she asked for me specifically, and because the investigators wanted somebody in the room she was not afraid of. I am going to give it to you as close to how she gave it as I can. The group left the lower lot on Wednesday the 26th at 9 in the morning. They went up White Oak Canyon past the falls, which is a hard climb, a lot of stone stairs and wet rock, and they took it slowly because Harold Butler was 62, and Denise Washington had a knee that she was honest about. They made the top of the falls a little after 1. They ate there. Tiffany remembered that the water was very loud, and that Alicia Simmons made a joke about how you could scream up there and nobody would hear a thing, and that everybody laughed, and that later she thought about that a great deal. They crossed over toward Cedar Run and camped the first night in a legal spot in the timber near the ridge, and the first night was completely ordinary. Cards, a small fire in a place where a fire was allowed. Butler told a story about his father working on the road crew that built Skyline Drive in the 30s, and about how his people had come off this mountain and never went back up it, not once, and about how his father would not say why. The second day is where it starts. They went north, off the main corridor, down into the drainage on a use trail that does not appear on the park map but appears on plenty of other maps that people download. Butler wanted to show them a home site. He had a photocopy of a 1934 survey with a family name on it, and he had a compass bearing, and he had been looking for the place for 11 years. They found it at about 11 in the morning. A chimney, mostly standing. 2 apple trees gone completely wild, tall and thin and reaching, with small hard fruit on the ground under them, a spring house foundation, and a stone wall that ran off into the laurel and did not seem to enclose anything. They ate lunch there. Denise Washington took photographs, and Jordan Flores, who Tiffany said was the least imaginative person she had ever met in her life, a man who worked in commercial insurance and read manuals for pleasure, walked out to the edge of the clearing to relieve himself and came back white and did not speak for 11 minutes. When he did speak, he said there was something standing in the laurel watching them, and it was tall, and it did not move when he looked at it, and it did not move when he kept looking at it, and that was the part that had scared him, not that it ran, that it did not. Everyone went out to look. There was nothing. Butler laughed at him. Alicia Simmons did not laugh. She was the one who found the print. I have to be careful here, because I have seen a great many things in this park that people call prints, and almost all of them are bare. A black bear walking flat-foot leaves a track that will absolutely stop your heart if you are not used to it. 5 toes, a broad pad, and if the front and rear feet overlap, which they do constantly, you get a shape that looks disturbingly like a barefoot man with a wide foot and a long stride. I am telling you what she found because she photographed it, and because I have the photograph, and because I have looked at it more times than is good for me. It was in the soft ground at the lip of the spring, in that black wet soil that holds a shape better than plaster. 16.5 inches from heel to toe, using Alicia's trekking pole as the scale, and she wrote the pole length on her hand in pen so there would be no argument later. 5 toes with a splay to them, the big toe not separate the way ours is but held in line. And in the middle of the arch there was a crease, a fold, running across the foot, the way a foot folds when it is flexing over uneven ground and taking weight. I am not going to tell you what that was. I am going to tell you that I have shown that photograph to 4 people whose job is tracks and sign, and 2 of them said bear and would not discuss it further, and 1 said he did not know, and the 4th one looked at it for a long time, and then handed my phone back and asked me not to send him a copy. If you are still with me this far in, do me a favor and leave a comment telling me what you think that crease was, because I have my own idea and I have never once said it out loud, and I would honestly rather hear yours. Subscribe if you want the rest of what came out of that canyon, and hit the like button so this finds the people who know this country, because a few of them are going to recognize the hollow before I name it. The group argued about the print for 2 hours. Butler was firm that it was bare. Flores wanted to leave immediately. Denise Washington, who was the calmest person in the party by a wide margin, and who had spent 30 years as a claims adjuster listening to people lie, said something that Tiffany could not stop repeating to us. She said, "We should decide right now whether we are the kind of people who go back and look, or the kind of people who go home and wonder." They voted. It was 4-1. Flores lost. They stayed. The second night, according to Tiffany, was when the knocking began. They had moved their camp back up out of the drainage to higher ground, which was the right call and the only genuinely good decision anyone made in that hollow. They were on a bench of flat ground under mature hemlock, mostly standing dead now because of the adelgid, which is another thing this park has lost and is not getting back. They had a fire. They had all 5 of them in a tight cluster of 3 tents, instead of spread out the way they had been the night before. The first knock came at approximately 9:30 in the evening. Tiffany described it as a single strike of wood on wood, hard, close, from the slope below them. Not a branch falling. A branch falling has a whole sound to it, a crack and a rush and a settling. This was one impact and then complete silence, the way a hammer sounds when you strike a fence post once and stop. 4 minutes later there was an answer from the opposite ridge. Butler said it was a woodpecker. It was 9:30 at night in late October, and Butler said it was a woodpecker. And Tiffany told us that in that moment she understood that Harold Butler was more frightened than any of them, and had been since the print, and that the reason he had been so firm about bear was that he needed it to be bear. The knocking went on for about 40 minutes. It was never fast. That is the detail that stayed with me, because in every account of this kind that I have ever taken, and I have taken more than you would think, the pattern is the same. It is not urgent, it is unhurried. One strike, then a wait that is long enough for you to convince yourself it is over, then an answer from somewhere else. 2 sources, then 3. Then, at around 11, one of the sources was above them, and none of them had heard it move. Nobody slept. At some point in the small hours, Denise Washington and Alicia Simmons shared a tent, and Denise recorded 11 minutes of audio on her phone, which is one of the 2 pieces of physical evidence that came out of this whole thing, and I will get to it. At first light on Friday the 28th they packed and started out, and they should have made the lot by 3 in the afternoon. They did not, because of what they walked into about a mile down. Tiffany called them the structures. In the interview she used her hands a lot when she got to this part, and she kept stopping and starting over, because she said she could not describe it in a way that did not sound stupid, and she was right. It does sound stupid, and I am going to describe it anyway because I went and looked at them myself on the 4th day of the search and I photographed 41 of them, and I have not been the same person since. Saplings, living saplings, mostly birch and young red maple, 8 to 14 feet tall, bent over from a height of about 6 or 7 feet and twisted, the fibers wrung around like you wring out a towel, and then the tops woven into the trunks of neighboring trees or into each other. Some were single, most were in groups. Several formed a rough arch that a person could walk under without ducking. There were more than 40 of them along about 600 yards of that drainage, and every one of them was oriented the same way, and the corridor they made ran downhill toward the home site. I have heard every explanation: ice damage, snow load, deer rubbing, a logging cable, a microburst. I have heard people say Native American trail markers, which is a well-meaning idea and also historically wrong in about 6 different ways for this particular region and this particular species of tree, and I would ask you not to repeat it. Here is what I know from standing in that drainage with my hand on one of them. The breakpoints were at 7 feet on ground that sloped away, which means whatever bent them was standing below the break and reaching up. The bark was not stripped. Ice strips bark. The wood was not snapped, it was wrung, and the fibers on the outside of the twist had separated along the grain in long ropey strands, and you do not get that from a load, you get that from torsion. And the cambium was still green on all of them, which means it had happened within about a season. And every single one of them was fresher than the last one as you went downhill, which in the language of my job means somebody was working their way up. I am going to admit something. I did not put all of that in the incident report. I put the count and the location and the coordinates and the photographs and the phrase anomalous vegetation damage, and I let the phrase sit there and do nothing, because I have a pension and 11 years of service, and there is a way of talking in this agency that gets you moved to a desk in Luray, and I was not willing to be moved. I have thought about that decision a great deal since. Tiffany said the group stopped when they saw the first one. Flores wanted to go back up and take the long route out, around the head of the drainage, which would have added 7 or 8 miles and put them on the ridge at nightfall with Butler's hip already going. Butler wanted to push straight through. Denise Washington broke the tie and said push through, and Alicia Simmons agreed, and Tiffany said she did not vote because she could not make her mouth work. They went through the corridor. Tiffany said it took about 25 minutes, and that during the entire 25 minutes, there was not one bird. Not a nuthatch, not a jay, not a crow. And this park in October is loud with birds. She said she kept expecting to come out the other side of the quiet the way you come out of a cloud when you are driving, and that they never did. Halfway through, Jordan Flores stopped and said, in a completely normal voice, as if remarking on the weather, that his mother was calling him from up the slope. Jordan Flores's mother had been dead since 2009. He said it, and then he laughed at himself, and then he did it again 40 seconds later, and this time he did not laugh, and Denise Washington took him by the pack strap and did not let go of it for the rest of the corridor. I want to sit with that one for a moment, because that is the part that people always want to explain away, and it is the part that I find least explainable. There is a well-documented ability in a number of animals to reproduce sounds. Ravens do it. Certain owls will lift a fragment of a sound out of the environment and give it back to you. And there is a much more ordinary explanation, which is that a frightened brain running on 2 hours of sleep and a great deal of adrenaline will build a familiar voice out of moving water and wind in a canyon, and it will build it perfectly, and it will be certain. I know that explanation. I have used that explanation. I have said it out loud to families in a low, kind voice, and I believed it when I said it. I stopped believing it on the 4th day. They came out of the corridor at about 11 in the morning, and they were within 2.5 miles of the lot, and it should have been finished right there. Tiffany said the birds came back. She said she almost cried with relief when she heard a jay. They stopped to filter water at the run. And that is where they lost Harold Butler. Nobody saw him go. That sentence is in the report 4 times, once for each surviving member of the party, in 4 different sets of words, and I have read a lot of statements in my career, and I have never seen 4 accounts agree so completely and so uselessly. They were spread out over maybe 30 feet along the run. Denise Washington was filtering. Alicia Simmons was sitting on a rock with her boots off. Jordan Flores was standing up on the bank, keeping watch, which he had been doing compulsively since the corridor. Tiffany Hughes was 6 feet from Butler and had her back to him for the length of time it takes to zip a pack. She turned around and his water bottle was on the gravel, upright, full, with the cap sitting beside it. His trekking poles were leaning against a rock. His pack was still on his shoulders when he went, because they never found it either. They called for 2 hours. They searched the run in both directions and up the bank and down into the Laurel. Flores went a 1/4 mile up the slope and came back with his forearms opened up by the branches. Denise Washington, who was the only one thinking, marked the spot with cairns and with a strip of orange cut from a stuff sack and wrote the time on her arm in pen. 2:17 in the afternoon on Friday the 28th of October. That mark was still legible on her arm 11 days later. I saw it. At about 4:30 they made a decision that I want to defend, because plenty of people have not. They went out for help. I have heard people say they should have stayed. I have heard it from people who have never been in a Laurel hell at dusk with no cell signal and a man missing and a 62-year-old man's poles leaning against a rock like he had just stepped away for a second. 4 people with headlamps and no radio were not going to find Harold Butler in that terrain in the night. What they were going to do was become 4 more missing people. Going out was correct. Going out was the only correct thing that happened in that hollow. They got about 1.5 miles. They did not make the lot. And this is where the accounts stop agreeing. Tiffany said that at approximately 6 in the evening, in the last usable light, they heard Harold Butler calling for help from up the slope. She said it was unmistakably him. She said he sounded close, and he sounded hurt, and he was using her name, and hers only, over and over, and she said the reason she knew it was wrong was that Harold Butler had called her Tiff for the entire trip, and this voice was saying Tiffany, the full name, with the accent on the wrong part of it, the way a person says a name they have read but never heard. Jordan Flores heard his mother again. Denise Washington heard a child crying, and she has no children. Alicia Simmons said she heard nothing at all. She said she watched the other 3 turn their heads toward the slope at the same moment, and she stood there in complete silence and understood, in a way she could not explain to us afterward, that she was the only one who was going to be able to think for the next 10 minutes, and that this was a job now, and she did that job, and I want her name remembered for it. She got them moving. She physically turned Tiffany Hughes around by the shoulders. She took Flores by the pack strap the way Denise had done in the corridor. And she got them 140 yards down the trail before Denise Washington stopped and would not go on. Denise said, and all three of them agree on the words, she said, "It is walking with us." They stood still, and they listened. There was something moving on the slope above the trail, parallel. At a distance Tiffany put it 40 feet, and Alicia put it twice that. It was not being quiet. That is the thing. It was making a great deal of noise, brush cracking, feet coming down heavy, and Tiffany said it kept pace exactly. And when they stopped, it stopped, and when they walked, it walked, and it never once got closer, and it never once fell behind. It did that for 11 minutes by Alicia's watch, which she checked, because she is the kind of person who checks. And then it got in front of them. They did not hear it pass. It was above and behind, and then it was ahead of them on the trail, and I do not have a way to make that make sense to you, and I am not going to try. Tiffany Hughes saw it. She is the only one who says she saw it clearly, and she was the closest, and she had a headlamp on, and she has never changed one detail of her account in 3 separate interviews across 9 days, which is more than I can say for most people describing a car accident. She said it was standing on the trail about 60 feet ahead where the trail bent around a rock nose. And it was not walking, it was standing with its back to them, and it was tall enough that her headlamp beam hit it at the middle of the back rather than at the head, and her headlamp was on her head, and she is 5'7". She said it was covered in hair that was not black and not brown and had reddish in it where the light hit, and that the hair moved in the wind in long strands, not like a coat but like something wet that had dried badly. She said the shoulders were wrong. She kept coming back to the shoulders. She said they were too far apart for the head, and that there was no neck she could see, and that when it began to turn, it did not turn its head first the way a person or a deer turns. The whole body came around together, slowly, from the hips. She said she never saw the face because Alicia Simmons hit the headlamp switch and put them into the night, and grabbed her, and they went off the trail down the fall line into the Laurel, all 4 of them, in the black, in the worst terrain in the mid-Atlantic, in October. She said that as she went over the edge of the bank she heard it make a sound. I have taken statements about that sound from more than a dozen people in this park over the years. Nobody can do it. Everybody tries. They all end up saying some version of the same 3 things. And Tiffany said all 3 of them in one sentence without knowing that she was reciting a liturgy that I have heard my whole career. She said it was too low. She said it went on for too long without a breath in it. And she said the worst part was that it had a shape to it, like language, like it was saying something in a mouth that was not built for saying anything. They went down the fall line about 400 vertical feet and split up in the process, which is what always happens, and which is exactly what the terrain is designed to do to you. Alicia Simmons and Denise Washington came out together at the bottom in the run. Jordan Flores came out alone, half a mile east. Tiffany Hughes did not come out at all. She stopped somewhere in the middle of that slope in the middle of the night, and she sat down against a chestnut oak, and she stayed there for 36 hours without moving, and she was still sitting there, dry and fed and full of water and completely still, when I found her on Sunday morning and heard her breathing before I saw her. When I asked her why she had not walked out in daylight, she said she had tried on Saturday morning. She said she stood up and took 9 steps. And then she said the thing that I have never been able to put down. She said, it was still there, and it had been there all night, and it had not touched me, and I understood that the only reason I was alive was that I had stopped, and so I stopped again. We recovered Alicia Simmons and Denise Washington on Saturday afternoon, about 4 hours before anyone even knew there was a search on for them, because Denise walked out to the fire road at Weekly Hollow under her own power, with Alicia leaning on her, and flagged down a truck. Jordan Flores walked into the old rag parking area at 8:50 on Saturday evening and asked a family from Ohio if they could tell him what day it was. That left Tiffany Hughes and Harold Butler. We got Tiffany on Sunday morning. We never got Harold Butler. I want to describe the 4th day, because that is the day I stopped being able to hold this at arm's length, and because I am aware that everything I have told you so far comes out of somebody else's mouth. What follows is mine. On Monday the 31st, we ran a grid on the drainage below the home site. 12 people abreast at 10-meter spacing, which is tight, tighter than we usually run. I was on the east flank. The weather was clear and cold, 38 degrees at start, no wind at ground level. At 10:40 in the morning, I found the second boot. It was 90 feet up the slope from the run, resting in the crotch of a downed hemlock about 5.5 feet off the ground, size 11, matched to the one from the culvert 11 miles away and 2,000 feet lower and on the other side of a ridge. I want you to sit with the geography for a second. That culvert drains a section of Skyline Drive that has no hydrological connection whatsoever to the drainage where the party was. Water from that hollow does not go to that culvert. Water from that hollow goes east, to the Robinson River, and eventually to the Rappahannock. And it takes it a long way from where I was standing with my hand on a hemlock. There is no natural process that puts one of a man's boots in that culvert and the other one in that tree. I logged it. I photographed it. And then I stood there for a while longer than my job allows, because 5.5 feet off the ground is not where things land. 5.5 feet off the ground is where things are put. At approximately 11:15, the grid found the second piece of physical evidence, which was hair. There was a great deal of it, caught in the bark of a shagbark hickory at a height of 6 feet 10 inches, in a fresh scrape about 4 inches across where the bark had been worn smooth. Bears rub. Bears rub constantly. And there are rub trees all over this park, and a big male black bear standing up can absolutely reach 6'10". The material was collected properly. Chain of custody, sealed, sent out. The results came back through the regional office in February, and I read them at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside me. The report described the sample as degraded, with insufficient nuclear material for confident sequencing, and returned a mitochondrial profile that the summary described as consistent with an unknown primate contaminant, most likely human handling contamination during collection. I collected that sample myself, gloved, into a sterile tube, from 6 feet 10 inches up a tree, on the 4th day, with 2 other people watching me do it. I have never asked for a second opinion. I want to be honest with you about why. It is not because I am afraid of what it would say. It is because I already know what it would say, and I know it would be the same sentence. And I know that sentence is a door that gets closed by people who are paid to close doors. And I did not want to spend the rest of my career walking up to a closed door. Now the recording. Denise Washington's phone captured 11 minutes and 41 seconds of audio between 2:11 and 2:23 in the morning on Friday the 28th of October, from inside a tent, on a slope of a hollow that I could walk you to tomorrow. For the first 6 minutes, there is nothing but the sound of 2 women breathing, and the small plastic noises of a tent in a light wind. At 6 minutes 14 seconds, there is a wood knock. It is very close. It is loud enough that the microphone distorts. At 6 minutes 51, there is a second knock from farther off. At 7 minutes 30, there is a sound that runs for 19 seconds. I have listened to it more than 100 times. It starts under the range of the microphone. So what you get first is not sound. It is the tent fabric responding to something you cannot hear. A kind of shivering in the recording. Then it comes up into the audible, and it is a long descending tone with a rasp in it, and it does not break for breath, and it does not repeat. And at about second 14 it changes shape 3 times in quick succession in a way that I can only describe as articulation. At 8 minutes 11 seconds, Denise Washington whispers a single word to Alicia Simmons. She whispers, "Please." At 11 minutes and 9 seconds, something walks past the tent. You can count the footfalls. There are 4 of them and then a 5th, and the spacing between them, measured against the known ground and the known distance to the fire ring, gives a stride of just over 5 feet. At 11 minutes 31, there is a small sound very near the microphone, and the recording ends because the phone was turned off. Denise Washington would not let us keep the phone. She let us copy the file. She was clear-headed about it, and she was polite, and she was absolutely immovable. And when I asked her why, she said something I have quoted to myself many times since. She said, "Because in a year you are going to have decided what it was, and I am going to want the version from before anybody decided." She was right. That is exactly what happened. The official finding for Harold Butler was recorded 11 months later. Presumed deceased. Probable cause listed as fall. Likely into a rock crevice or under debris in steep terrain. Body not recovered. And I want to tell you that this is a completely reasonable finding, and that it happens, and that this park has swallowed people before and given them back years later as a single bone under a rhododendron root. And it will do it again. That finding is probably right. It is the word probably that has cost me my sleep, and it is going to keep costing. I went back alone in April. I want to be clear that this was not authorized and it was not clever, and I would write somebody up for it. I signed out on a personal day. I parked at a trailhead that is not the trailhead. I carried a radio that was not on the park net, and I told exactly one person where I was going and when to start worrying, and that person is the reason I am able to tell you any of this. I went to the home site. The apple trees were in bloom. That is the thing nobody warns you about with these old places. Somebody planted those trees in maybe 1890, and that family was moved off this mountain by the Commonwealth of Virginia in 1935, and their house is a chimney and a hole now, and those trees are still coming into flower every April for nobody at all. There is a smell to it, sweet and heavy and completely out of place in a forest, and it carries a long way in a hollow. The structures were still there, fewer than 41, because a hard winter had brought some down, but more than 30, and I counted 6 new ones. 6 new ones. Green wood, rung at the same height, oriented the same way. I sat down on the springhouse foundation with my back against the stone, and I ate a sandwich, and I did not do anything remotely investigative for about 2 hours. I want to be honest about what I was doing up there. I was not looking for Harold Butler. Harold Butler is on that mountain somewhere, and I am at peace with the fact that I am not going to be the one who finds him. I went up there to be looked at. That is the only way I can put it. Because in the 11 days of that search, and in the 280 days after it, the feeling that never once left me was not fear exactly. It was the specific and unmistakable sensation of being an object of attention, and I had reached a point where I would rather go and stand in front of the thing than keep carrying the feeling around Lurie and Front Royal and my own kitchen. Nothing came. I want to be honest about that too, because I am aware of how these accounts usually finish, and I am not going to build you an ending that I did not get. Nothing came out of the laurel. There was no knock. There was no sound. It was an ordinary spring afternoon in one of the most beautiful places in the eastern United States, and there were warblers moving through, and the water in the spring was running clear and cold the way it has run since before anybody had a name for it. I got up at about 4 in the afternoon, and I put my pack on and I turned around. On the flat stone where I had set my pack down, there were 3 apples, wild apples, small and hard and green, off those old trees, set in a line, evenly spaced about 4 inches apart, on a stone that had been empty when I put my pack on it because I had brushed the leaves off it with my own hand 2 hours earlier. I did not touch them. I photographed them. Then I walked out, and I did not walk fast, and I did not look up the slope, and I have thought about that discipline a great deal since, and I am proud of it in a way that I cannot explain to anybody who has not had to do it. That is not evidence. 3 apples on a rock is not evidence of anything. A squirrel could do that, except that a squirrel could not do that, and I know it, and you know it, and here we are. Here is where everybody ended up. Alicia Simmons went back to Baltimore and went back to work, and is, by every measure I have, entirely fine. She sent me a card the following Christmas. She wrote that she does not think about it much, and that she hopes I do not either, and I understood that to be a kindness rather than a description. Denise Washington has not been in a forest since. Not a state park, not a picnic ground. She told me that on the phone with no particular emotion in her voice, the way you would tell somebody you had given up coffee. Jordan Flores moved to Arizona. He calls me about twice a year, usually late, and we do not really talk about that hollow. We talk around it. Once he asked me whether I thought his mother had actually been up there, and I said no, and he said good, and neither of us believed the exchange. Tiffany Hughes and I still speak. She is the reason I finally started saying any of this out loud, because she asked me to, And because she said something to me that I have come to think is the truest sentence anybody has said about this park. She said that what frightened her was not that it hunted them. She said it never hunted them. She said that a thing which is hunting you does not walk beside you making noise for 11 minutes and then get in front of you and stand there with its back turned. She said it was showing them out. She said it walked them to the edge of the drainage the way you walk somebody to the door when they have stayed too long. And that Harold Butler was the one who had not wanted to leave, who had spent 11 years looking for that clearing, who had a photocopy of a 1934 survey in his pocket with his own family name printed on it. Because that is the part one have not told you, and it is the last thing I am going to say. The survey Butler was carrying was of his own people's land. His father came off that mountain in 1935 as a boy, in a wagon, and never went back up, not once, and would not say why. Butler was not a visitor in that hollow. He was the first one of his blood to walk back into that clearing in 87 years, and he went in there apologizing to it, and he did not come out. I do not know what stood on that trail. I want to be careful with you at the very end here, because it would be easy to give you the word everybody wants, and let you close the tab satisfied. I have seen misidentified bear. I have seen sleep deprivation build a voice out of running water. I have seen otherwise reliable adults construct a shared memory in the space of one bad night. And I have seen it happen fast enough to frighten me more than any print in the mud ever has. All of that is real, and all of that explains most of this, and none of it explains a man's second boot resting 5.5 feet off the ground in the crotch of a hemlock on the wrong side of a ridge. What I know is this. Around 500 families were taken off this mountain, and their homes were pulled down, and the forest came back over the top of all of it, and we drew a green line around it and called it protected. And every year 400,000 people come up here and look at the view from the overlooks and go home. And underneath that view there are hollows where the ground still remembers whose it was. Most of the time it lets you walk through. I have walked through 1,000 times. But if you go up into Shenandoah, and you get off the marked trail, and you find a chimney standing in a clearing with 2 old apple trees gone wild beside it, I would ask you to do one small thing for me. Eat your lunch, take your photographs, say something out loud, even if you feel stupid saying it, about how you are only passing through, and then leave before the light goes. Because whatever came down that drainage bending saplings at 7 feet was not in a hurry, and it was not hiding, and it was not hunting. It was keeping the place, and it was very good at its job. If this one got under your skin, leave a comment and tell me which part you would not have been able to walk away from, because I read every single one of them. Subscribe so you do not miss the next hollow, and give this a like before you go. There are more of these than I have time to tell, and the ones I have not told yet are worse. Stay on the trail. Every October, on the first night the temperature at Big Meadows drops below freezing, I carry a paper plate up an unmaintained trace above the old Butler place, and I set it down on a flat gray stone that was sitting there long before this land was ever called a park. On the plate I put 4 things: a strip of salt pork, a handful of shelled corn, a tin cup of coffee that I pour out over the stone instead of leaving standing, and one small object that belonged to a person who is no longer alive. I have done this for 9 years. It is not written in any manual. There is no box for it on the patrol log, and no incident code that covers it. And if my district supervisor ever walked up that trace and asked me directly what I was doing off duty in a government uniform at 2 in the morning, I do not know what I would tell her. I have thought about it more than I would like to admit. I have never come up with an answer that would let me keep my job. The first year, I did not know to do it. That was the autumn Jordan Flores walked into Nicholson Hollow with a full pack, a park radio, and a laminated quadrangle map, and came out 91 hours later carrying none of those 3 things and completely unable to say where he had been. I want to tell you about that autumn properly, because most of what got written down about it is wrong, and the parts that are not wrong were written in a language designed to make sure nobody would ever ask a follow-up question. Shenandoah National Park is a long, thin ribbon of mountain running about 105 miles down the spine of the Blue Ridge in Virginia. Skyline Drive rides the top of it like a scar. From the overlooks it looks tame. It looks like a postcard. 2 hours from the capital, 4 million visitors in a good year, gift shops selling blackberry jam, families and rental cars stopping at every pull-off to photograph the same blue ridgelines fading into each other like sheets of glass. What the postcards do not tell you is that the moment you step off the pavement and drop below the ridge, the park stops being a park. 200,000 acres, and roughly 80% of it is designated wilderness. Below the road, the terrain falls away in hollows so steep and so tangled with mountain laurel that a person standing 40 feet from you can be completely invisible. Cell service does not exist down there. Radio is unreliable because the ridges eat the signal. There are places in this park where the closest human being to you is 3 miles up and 2 miles over, and it will take that person 6 hours to reach you if everything goes right. And the other thing the postcards do not tell you is that people live down in those hollows, whole communities. They were farming those slopes and burying their families in those coves for generations before a decision was made somewhere far away that this land would look better empty. In the 1930s, they were moved out. Some went willingly with a check. Some were carried out. A few of the old ones simply refused, and the government waited for them to die and then took the cabins. Harold Butler was born 18 years after his family was removed from the head of that hollow, and he never once in his life called it a park. He called it home, and he called the removal what it was, and he was the only person in that entire county who understood what actually lives up there. I did not know any of that in October of that first year. In October of that first year, I was a fairly ordinary backcountry ranger with a district that included the Old Rag Corridor, and my biggest professional concern was a series of bear incidents that did not make any sense. That was Alicia Simmons. Alicia was 46, and she had a wildlife research contract with the park studying black bear movement, and she had 11 bears wearing collars across the Central District. She came into the office at Bird on the 4th of October with a laptop and a look on her face that I have never forgotten, and she put the screen down in front of me and said, "Tell me what is wrong with this picture." It was a map of the Central District with 11 colored tracks laid over it. Bears wander. Bears are lazy and opportunistic, and their movement looks like somebody scribbled on a map with a leaky pen. That is normal. What was on her screen was not scribbling. Every single collared bear in the Central District had, over the course of about 9 days, drifted out of one specific area of Nicholson Hollow and its upper feeder draws. Not fled, drifted, steadily, and without ever crossing back through, the way water moves away from something dropped into it. The empty space on that map was roughly 1.5 miles across, and it had a shape to it, and the shape had not existed 3 weeks earlier. "Bears do not do that," she said. "There is nothing there for them to avoid. There is no fire, no logging, no construction, and I would know about all three. There is no dominant male in that zone." I checked. The zone is empty. I asked her what she thought it was. "I think something moved in," she said. "And I think it is big enough that 11 black bears independently decided the massed crop up there was not worth the trouble." Denise Washington was working dispatch that month out of the district office. Denise was 54, 26 years in the service, and she had the flattest and most unbothered radio voice I have ever heard in my life. She once talked a man with a compound fracture through his own splinting in the same tone you would use to read a grocery list. Nothing shook her. That is important, and I want you to hold on to it. Because of everything that happened that autumn, the thing that scared me worst was hearing Denise Washington lose her voice on an open channel. Jordan Flores was 48, and he had been maintaining trail in this park since he was 22. He was one of those men who could look at a section of tread and tell you what year it was last rehabbed and who had done the work. He knew that hollow better than the survey maps did. He went in on the morning of the 11th of October to scout water bar damage on a lower section that had been chewed up by the September storms. A one-night trip, standard. He gave Denise his check-in schedule before he went down. 1700 hours on the 11th, and again at 0900 on the 12th. The 1700 came through fine. He said the tread was worse than expected. He said he would need a crew in 2 days. He said one other thing, which Denise wrote in the log because she wrote down everything, and which nobody thought about for another 18 hours. He said, "It is real quiet down here." The 0900 did not come. 91 hours. The first 4 hours of a missed check-in are the worst kind of hours, because officially nothing has happened yet. Radios fail in that terrain constantly. Batteries die. Men who have been walking these mountains for 26 years get absorbed in a piece of work and forget the time. Denise ran the standard escalation, which is to say she called him every 15 minutes on 2 channels and logged every attempt, and I drove down off the ridge to the parking area at the mouth of the hollow to lay eyes on his vehicle. The truck was where it should have been. Parked green, government plates, backed into the gravel the way he always backed in. Both doors were standing open. His personal phone was in the cup holder. His wallet was on the passenger seat. The key was in the ignition and turned to accessory, and the vehicle radio was on, tuned to the park repeater, hissing at me softly in the cold. Now, I want to be accurate here, because this is the part where a certain kind of story would tell you that I felt a chill, or that I knew immediately. I did not. What I actually felt was irritation. My first thought was that Jordan had hiked out early, come back to the truck, and then walked off somewhere without securing it, which is a thing tired people do. My second thought was that a bear had gotten into the cab, because we had a black bear that season working the parking areas for coolers. So I checked the cab for claw marks and food wrappers, and I found neither. And then I found the third thing, and the third thing was when the irritation went away. His boots were sitting on the driver's side floor mat, side by side, laces tucked in, placed, not dropped. Jordan Flores had walked out of that hollow, or been brought out of it, and had taken his boots off and set them down neatly, and then had gone somewhere in his socks and left his wallet and his phone behind. I called it in. Denise did not ask me a single unnecessary question. She spun up a search inside of 20 minutes, and by 1400 hours we had 31 people staging at the mouth of that hollow, and by nightfall we had a helicopter out of the state police doing thermal passes along the drainage. The helicopter is worth talking about for a moment. Thermal works well in that park in October because the air is cold and the ground has already given up its heat, so a human body shows up like a struck match. That aircraft flew the length of Nicholson Hollow, and its feeder draws 4 separate times over 2 nights. It picked up 9 deer, a great deal of small warm clutter, and 2 of our own ground teams. On the second pass of the second night, the pilot came over the air and asked us to confirm the position of every ground team we had in the drainage, because he had a signature at the head of the hollow, up in the steep ground below the ridge, that was reading much larger than a person. Denise confirmed all teams. Every one of them was accounted for, and every one of them was more than a mile from that position. The pilot came back around. He was silent for about 40 seconds, which is a very long time on an open channel with 31 people listening. Then he said the signature was no longer there. He did not say it had moved. There is a difference, and every one of us on that channel heard it. A thermal signature that moves shows you a track. This one had been in the open on a talus slope where there was no canopy to slide under, and between one pass and the next it was simply absent. He flew that slope for another 11 minutes and found nothing, and then he had to brake for fuel, and by the time he came back the fog had come up out of the hollow the way it does, and the aircraft was useless for the rest of the operation. I met Harold Butler on the morning of the 3rd day. He came up the fire road on foot from the private land at the eastern boundary, 62 years old, wearing a canvas coat that was older than some of my search team, and he stood at the edge of our staging area and waited to be noticed instead of walking in. That is a mountain thing. He would not cross into a group of working men uninvited even if the ground had been his grandfather's. I went over, he asked, politely, how long the missing man had been down. I told him. Somewhere past 60 hours by then. He looked past me at the hollow for a while. The fog was burning off the lower slopes in ragged pieces and the color was coming into the maples. Then he said, "You are searching the bottom." I said we were searching the bottom and the benches and the ridge trail above it. "Search up," he said. "Not the ridge, up in the trees. He will be higher than you think a man can be, and he will not answer you when you call him, and you will walk under him twice before you look." I asked him why he would say something like that. Harold Butler looked at me for a long moment with an expression I could not read at the time, and can read perfectly now, which is the expression of a man calculating exactly how much truth he can afford to hand to a stranger in a uniform. "Because that is where they put the last one," he said. "Before I let you walk any further into that hollow with me, do me one small favor. If this story has its hooks in you, press the like button and leave a comment telling me the name of the wildest piece of country you have ever been alone in after sundown. I read them and subscribed to the channel, because the things I am about to describe are only the beginning of what came out of that autumn. We found Jordan Flores at 1440 on the fourth day. He was 19 feet off the ground, wedged into the crotch of a chestnut oak on a 40-degree slope, roughly 2/3 of a mile north of any trail. He was alive. He was hypothermic and severely dehydrated, and he had 4 cracked ribs and a great deal of bruising across his back and both shoulders. He had no pack, no radio, no map, and no socks. We had walked under that tree. I want to be honest about that. 2 separate teams had passed within 80 yards of that oak on the second day, calling his name, and he had been up there the entire time. When we got him down, he was conscious. He knew his own name and he knew mine. He knew the year and he knew the park. He could not tell us one single thing about where he had been for 91 hours. Not confused, not concussed. The medical people were clear about that later, and I am choosing my words carefully because certain job titles are not ones I use. He was evaluated thoroughly. There was no head injury. There was no stroke. There was no substance in his blood. There was simply a hole. He remembered walking the lower tread on the 11th. He remembered the light going long in the afternoon. He remembered stopping to eat, and he remembered the woods getting quiet, and he remembered standing up and turning around because he had the feeling you get when a large animal is behind you. And then he remembered being cold in a tree and hearing us calling his name, and being absolutely certain, in a way he could not explain and did not want to discuss, that he must not answer. What the old families left out. The official file on Jordan Flores closed 22 days later. Disorientation of unknown origin. Probable exposure event. Recommend review of solo backcountry assignment policy. That is the entire institutional memory of what happened to him. I have read it. It is 4 pages long, and 3 of those pages are search resource accounting. I could not leave it there, and neither could Alicia Simmons, and for very different reasons neither could Denise Washington, and the 3 of us started meeting after hours at a picnic table behind the maintenance yard in the last week of October, with the collar data, the search maps, and a growing pile of things that did not fit. Alicia went first, because Alicia had numbers, and numbers are the only thing that ever gets anybody in this agency to listen. She had pulled every trail camera in the Central District. 51 units. Motion triggered, infrared, the same equipment we use for bear and deer surveys, set at knee to chest height on game trails and drainages. 14 of those cameras sat inside or on the edge of the empty zone on her bear map. Between the 29th of September and the 18th of October, those 14 cameras collectively recorded 1,900 triggers. Of those 1,900, over 1,600 were empty frames. No animal, no person, nothing in the field of view at all. Vegetation motionless, wind data from the Big Meadow station showing dead calm on most of the timestamps. Something was triggering those sensors and not appearing in the image. Alicia had a professional explanation ready, and she offered it before I could, because that is the kind of researcher she was. Passive infrared sensors trigger on a moving heat differential crossing the detection field. A large, warm body moving through the outer edge of the field, below or beside the lens cone, can absolutely trip a camera and never appear in frame. Which means it was moving past them, she said, repeatedly, for 3 weeks, and it was tall enough or low enough to stay out of the cone every single time on 14 separate units. Do you understand what that means? Deer do not do that. Bears do not do that. Bears walk up and chew on the housing. This thing was learning where the lens was. 3 of the 14 cameras were found knocked out of alignment, pointed at the ground or the sky. The mounting straps were not chewed, they were loosened. And 1 camera, on the 12th of October, at 4:19 in the morning, produced a single frame that was not empty. I have seen it. I am not going to tell you it was a clean photograph, because it was not. And anybody who tells you they have a clean photograph is selling something. What that frame showed was the lower portion of a leg and part of a torso at extremely close range, badly overexposed by the infrared flash, filling roughly the left third of the image. Skin visible under coarse hair, the way you see skin on an old horse in winter. The leg was in the frame, and the ground was in the frame, and using the known height of the camera mount and a tape measure on the tree, 6 weeks later, Alicia put the width of that lower leg at the calf at something close to 9 inches. For scale, mine is about 6. Denise brought something different, and Denise brought it reluctantly, because Denise was a career professional 2 years from full retirement, and what she was carrying was the kind of thing that gets written into your file forever. She brought the dispatch tapes. Every radio transmission in that park is recorded and time-stamped. During the search we ran 2 channels hard for 4 days. Denise had gone back through all of it, every hour, with headphones, on her own time. On the second night, at 23:14, in a gap between 2 team check-ins, the recording contains a transmission that was never made by any radio we had in the field. It is 11 seconds long. It is not speech. It is a series of 3 heavy impacts, wood on wood, spaced roughly 2 seconds apart, followed by a long, low sound that Denise described in her notes as being like a man moaning into a pipe, dropping in pitch at the end. Then the channel is clear again. Every handheld we deploy is accounted for by serial number. All 31 were signed out and signed back in. None of them was in a position to key up and transmit that. I have listened to it 200 times, Denise said. She had her hands flat on the picnic table. There is only one way that gets on my tape. Something out there was close enough to a keyed radio to be picked up by it, which means for 11 seconds, one of my teams had that thing standing next to them, and nobody on that team ever said one word about it to me. I asked her which team. She told me, and I went and I asked them, all 4 of them, separately weeks apart, in casual conversation so that nobody would feel cornered. 3 of them had nothing. The 4th, a seasonal in his 2nd year, went very still and said he had been on the outside of the line that night, on the downhill side, and that at some point he had heard knocking that he assumed was one of us signaling, and had answered it by striking a tree twice with the back of his axe, and that something had answered him back, once, from much closer than the first knocking had been. He said he never wrote it up because he did not want to be the seasonal who put a monster in an incident report. Which brings me to Harold Butler, and to the front porch of a house on private land at the eastern boundary where I sat with a cup of coffee on the 1st of November while he told me the part of the history of this park that is not on any interpretive sign. Harold's people had lived at the head of that hollow since before the Civil War. His grandfather was born there. His father was 11 years old when the state condemned the land, and the families were moved out to resettlement tracts down in the Piedmont. And Harold grew up in a house 9 miles from a mountain he was not allowed to live on, listening to men who had been born on it. "You want to know what my grandfather called it?" he said. I said I did. "He did not call it anything," Harold said. "That is the first thing you need to get through your head. You do not name a thing you have to live next to. Naming it is how you make it your business. They called it the old man, or they called it him. Or mostly they just tipped their chin at the ridge and everybody knew who was being discussed. He told me the shape of it, because there were rules, and the rules are the entire point. You did not hunt the upper draws above a certain stone that everybody knew. That ground was not yours. You did not whistle after sundown, and you did not call out a person's name in the open after sundown either, because a name spoken aloud up there could be picked up and used, and the thing that used it was very good at it and did not use it kindly. You did not answer a voice you could not see. Not a familiar one. Especially not a familiar one. And on the first hard frost. And at any time when the mast crop failed and the woods went hungry, the families up in that hollow put out a portion. Salt pork, corn, whatever they had, on the flat stone. It was not worship, Harold said, and there was an edge in his voice when he said it, because he had clearly had this conversation before with people who wanted it to be quaint. Nobody prayed to it. It was rent. You are living on ground that something else was on first, and something bigger than you does not have to tolerate you, so you pay a little for the tolerating. Same as you would leave a share for a neighbor whose fence you were using. That is all it ever was. I asked him what happened when the families were moved out in the 30s. Harold Butler set his cup down on the porch rail and looked up at the ridge for a long time. Then nobody paid it, he said. For 90 years, nobody paid it. And every so often it comes down and reminds somebody that the arrangement was not made with the land. It was made with us. The fourth night at the Corbin Trace, I went back into that hollow on the 9th of November. I want to be very clear about why, because I have gone over it many times since, and the reason I gave everybody at the time was not the real reason. The reason I gave was that Alicia had a research permit to retrieve and reposition 14 cameras, that the terrain required at least 2 people for safety, and that as the district backcountry ranger I was the appropriate escort. All of that is true, and all of it was written up correctly and approved. The real reason is that I had spent 5 weeks looking at a photograph of a 9-inch calf and listening to 11 seconds of tape, and I needed to know. There were 4 of us. Me, Alicia, with her camera gear and a field recorder and a laptop. Harold, who was not park staff and had no business being there, and who I brought anyway under a volunteer designation that I filled out badly on purpose. And Jordan Flores. Jordan asked to come. He had been cleared for full duty 6 days earlier. He came into my office and closed the door and told me that he had not slept more than 3 hours at a stretch since October, that he did not remember anything and probably never would, and that he could not go on working in a park where there was a hollow he was afraid to walk into. He said he needed to walk in on his own feet and walk back out on them. I said yes. I have thought about that decision more than any other decision in my career. We went in on a cold, clear afternoon with about 4 inches of dry leaf on the ground and no wind at all. The leaf litter is important. In November in that park, you cannot move quietly. Every step is audible for 60 yards. Anything the size of a deer sounds like a person walking. Anything the size of a person sounds like a truck. We pulled 6 cameras on the way up and made our camp at the flat where an old home site used to be, about 100 yards below the stone Harold had described. There was still a chimney fall there, and a depression that had been a root cellar, and 2 ancient apple trees that were still fruiting, gone wild and small and hard. Harold walked around that flat once with his hat in his hand and did not say anything to anybody, and I did not ask. We had a fire going by 1700. It was full night by 18. The first thing was the silence, and Jordan named it before I did. There are no true silent woods in Virginia, not even in November. There are field mice in the leaf litter, and squirrels shifting, and owls, and the small constant ticking of a forest cooling down. It is a floor of sound you stop hearing because it is always there. At some point between 18 and 1900, that floor went out from under us, not gradually. Alicia noticed it on the recorder before any of us noticed it with our ears, because she was monitoring levels, and she took the headphones off and looked at me and said the ambient floor had dropped by a measurable amount in under 90 seconds. The second thing was the smell. I have handled bear carcasses. I have crawled into dens. I have been downwind of a rotting deer in August. This was not that, and it was not a skunk, and it was not any of the things I spent the following winter trying to convince myself it was. It came in on us in a slow wave with no wind to carry it, and it was thick and warm and organic. And the closest I can get is a wet dog that has been rolling in something dead, layered over a smell like a hot penny, layered over something sour and sharp underneath that made the back of my throat close. It arrived, and it sat on that flat with us for maybe 2 minutes, and then it thinned out and was gone. Harold said, very quietly, without moving, "Do not stand up." The third thing was the rock. It landed in the leaves about 30 feet uphill of the fire, and it was not a small rock. I heard it come through the canopy. It was thrown high, and it came down at a steep angle, which means it was thrown from a long way out, and when I paced it the next morning and worked backward from the angle of the strike, the closest possible launch point was 110 yards away and upslope through standing timber. I have thrown rocks my entire life. I played ball. I want you to try to picture a man standing on a 40-degree slope in blackness, at night, throwing a stone the size of a grapefruit 110 yards uphill through trees and dropping it in a specific clearing. Then the knocking started. 3 impacts, heavy, wood on wood, spaced about 2 seconds apart, from up near the ridge. Then nothing for perhaps 4 minutes. Then 3 more from a completely different bearing, well off to our east, which meant either there were 2 of them, or the first one had covered 400 yards of that terrain in 4 minutes without making a sound in 4 inches of dry leaves. Alicia had the recorder running the whole time. She got all of it. I have listened to that file more times than is good for a person. And then, at 21:40 on the 9th of November, the thing happened that broke that night in half. Out of the blackness, from somewhere on the slope above the camp, a voice called my name. It was Jordan's voice. It was absolutely, unmistakably Jordan Flores, the same voice I had heard on a park radio for years, calling my name the way you would call to somebody you had lost track of on a trail, 2 syllables, lifting at the end, perfectly casual. And Jordan Flores was sitting 8 feet from me on the other side of the fire with his hands wrapped around a cup and his mouth shut. Nobody moved. The fire popped. Alicia had gone the color of paper, and her hand was over her mouth. It called again. Closer, maybe 60 yards, the same 2 syllables, the same lift, except this time there was something wrong with the shape of it, a wetness in it, the way a word sounds when somebody says it with a mouthful. Jordan started to stand up. I have never seen a man's face do what his did. He was not going toward it. He was going away from something. He was getting up to run, and his eyes were not tracking anything in that clearing. Harold Butler moved faster than any 62-year-old man I have ever seen. He got a hand on Jordan's shoulder and pushed him back down onto the log hard enough to knock the wind out of him, and he put his mouth next to Jordan's ear, and I heard exactly what he said because the woods were so quiet. He said, "Do not answer it. It has had you once. The stone above the Butler place." Nobody slept. I want to describe what the rest of that night was actually like, because films get this part wrong. There was no siege. Nothing charged the camp. What there was, for 7 consecutive hours, was pressure. It circled us. Not in a clean ring, but in long, slow arcs, and we could track it by the leaves. 4 inches of dry oak leaf on a steep slope cannot be crossed silently by anything heavy. And this thing was not trying to be silent anymore. We would hear a slow, deliberate crunching move from our northwest around to our north, pause for 20 minutes, and then start again from a bearing 300 yards away with nothing in between. Twice we heard it come down to within what I would put at 40 yards, close enough that we could hear the individual placement of each foot, and both times it stopped and simply stood there, and we sat around a fire and listened to a thing breathe. You do not forget the breathing. It was slow. It was enormous. There was a catch at the top of each inhale. Around 3 in the morning, Alicia asked, in a whisper, why it did not come in. Harold said, "Because you are 4 and there is fire. It is not stupid. It has never once in its life needed to be brave." At first grayness, we broke camp. We did not put the fire out properly, which is a violation I will carry, but nobody was willing to be the last one standing over dead coals. Coming out is where it went wrong. The route out of that flat drops down a bench and crosses 2 feeder draws before it picks up the old trace that runs down to the trail. It is not complicated ground. I have walked it dozens of times. We went out in a line with me leading, Alicia second, Jordan third, and Harold at the tail, and by the time we hit the first draw, the fog had come up out of the hollow so thick that I could not clearly see Alicia 6 feet behind me. The fog in that park is not weather. It is the hollow breathing. It comes up out of the drainages on cold mornings, and it fills the coves to the brim, and it can go from clear to 15 feet of visibility in under 4 minutes. We crossed the first draw. I called back for a count and got 3 answers. We started up the far side, and there was a noise off to my left, upslope, heavy and close and moving parallel to us, and I stopped and turned toward it. And every one of us made the same mistake at the same time, which was to turn uphill and stop moving. When I turned back around, Alicia was there, and Jordan was there. Harold was not. We called for him. We broke the rule immediately and completely. all three of us shouting his name into 15 feet of visibility, and the fog took our voices and flattened them and gave us nothing back. Then, from downslope and behind us, in the direction we had come from, Harold Butler's voice answered. He said, "Here." I went toward it. I got perhaps 20 steps and Jordan got a fistful of the back of my collar and hauled me backward off my feet, and I went down in the wet leaves. And he put his face 6 inches from mine and said in a whisper that was barely air, "That is not where he is. Listen to it." And I listened, and the voice called again, from the same bearing, saying the same word, in exactly the same way, with exactly the same inflection, like a needle skipping. We went the other direction. We went uphill, fast, breaking every protocol about splitting from a route. And about 200 yards up we came out of the worst of the fog into that flat gray light you get above a cloud layer. And we came out on a bench I did not recognize, and standing on that bench about 80 feet from us was the thing that had been circling our fire. I have had 8 years to decide how to describe this, and I am still not satisfied with any of it. It was standing under the edge of the canopy where the light was poorest, and it was aware of that. It did not move at all. The first thing my brain did was reject it, and I do not mean that poetically. I mean that for about 2 full seconds I looked at it and my mind returned the answer tree, because that was the only category available for something that tall and that still. Height is the thing everybody wants, and it is the thing I trust least, so I will give it to you the way I measured it, rather than the way I felt it. There was a snapped-off yellow poplar behind, and slightly to the left of where it stood, and I went back to that bench 11 days later with Alicia and a laser rangefinder and a tape, and we established that the top of that thing's head, at the position where it stood, was at a height on that trunk of 7 feet 9 inches, and that it was standing about a foot below the base of the trunk on the slope. It was wider through the shoulders than any human being I have ever seen. Not the width of a heavy man, the width of a doorway. Its arms hung well below where mine hang, and the hands at the end of them were not proportioned like a person's hands. The hair was not black. Everybody says black. It was a dull reddish brown over most of the body, gone gray and sparse across the chest and along the ribs, and there was no hair at all across the upper part of the face, where the skin was the color of a wet river stone. It had a face. That is the part one have never been able to say out loud to anybody who was not standing there. Not an ape's face. Something in between, with a heavy brow shelf that put the eyes in permanent shadow, and a flat, wide nose, and a mouth that was closed and set. And it looked at us with an expression that I have spent 8 years failing to unsee, because there was nothing animal in it at all. It was the flat, level, unhurried look of something looking at a problem it has solved before. It was old. I do not know how I knew that. The gray in the chest hair, maybe, or a stiffness in how it held one shoulder. It was old, and it was thin under the coat of it. Thinner than it should have been, and it was the 9th of November in a year when the mast crop in that district had failed almost completely, and every one of Alicia's bears had gone down and out to the lowlands weeks early because there was nothing up there to eat. It was hungry. That is what I understood, standing on that bench. This was not a haunting. This was an old animal in a bad autumn coming down into ground it had used for a very long time, and finding that the people who used to pay were gone, and that the ones who had replaced them did not know they owed anything. Then Harold Butler came up out of the fog to our left, on his own 2 feet, breathing hard, with leaves stuck to one whole side of him where he had gone down. He did not look at us. He walked out past us onto that open bench, 10 steps, closer to it than any of us, and he took off his hat, and he put the paper sack he was carrying down on the flat gray stone that I had walked past twice that morning without ever once seeing it for what it was. He backed up, not turning. He backed all the way to us with his hat in his hand. The thing under the canopy shifted its weight for the first time in 90 seconds, and it made a sound, low, chesty, drawn out, dropping in pitch at the end. The same 11-second sound that is on Denise Washington's dispatch tape. Then it turned and went uphill. And I want to tell you about how it moved, because it is the detail that finally ended the argument in my own head. It did not lumber. It went up a 40-degree talus slope in the fog on 2 legs, without using its hands, without dislodging one loose rock, at a walking pace, and it was gone into the gray in under 6 seconds. Nobody spoke for a long time. Then Alicia Simmons sat down in the wet leaves and put her head on her knees, and Harold put his hat back on and said, in an absolutely ordinary voice, that we ought to get moving because the fog would not lift until 10. We came out at 11:20 on the 10th of November. Denise Washington had our vehicles in sight from the mouth of the hollow, and she watched all four of us walk down that fire road. And she has told me since that she knew from the way we were walking that she was not going to like the report. The report I filed says that a research retrieval detail of 4 persons made camp at a historic home site. That camp was disturbed for a period of approximately 7 hours by an unidentified large animal exhibiting bluff behavior, including vocalization and thrown debris, and that the detail withdrew in the morning without injury. It recommends that the upper drainage be temporarily closed to overnight backcountry use pending assessment. Every word of that is true. It is also, in the way that only official language can be, a complete lie. And I wrote it that way on purpose. And Denise read it and signed it and never once asked me to add anything. The closure was approved. It stayed in place for 2 seasons on the strength of aggressive bear activity, and then it quietly lapsed, and it is open ground again now. And there are people who camp up there every fall and come out with nothing but photographs and sore knees. Most of them do. That is worth saying plainly. Whatever is up there is not a machine for killing hikers. If it were, this park would be a different kind of place, and you would have heard about it on the news. Alicia Simmons finished her contract in the spring and did not renew it. She took a position in a different state, working on an entirely different species. We talk maybe twice a year. She has never published a word about the camera frame or the collar data, and when I asked her why, she said the honest thing, which is that she has a career and a mortgage, and that the data would not survive contact with the review process, and that she would rather keep working than be the punchline that ends her field. She still has the audio. She sent me a copy on an unmarked drive with no note in it. I have it in a lockbox with some other things. Jordan Flores went back to trail work and is still doing it. He has never remembered those 91 hours, and he has stopped wanting to. He works with a partner now, always, and he is out of the backcountry by 1600 in the fall, and he does not discuss any of it. Once, about 3 years ago, at a retirement party for somebody else, he had 2 beers and told me that he does not think it hurt him on purpose. He said the ribs were from the tree. He said he thinks it carried him a long way and put him up high the way you would put something you had caught somewhere a bear would not get it, and then it went away and did not come back for him, and he does not know why, and that is the part that keeps him up. Denise Washington took her full retirement 14 months later. Before she left, she did one last thing, which was to make sure a copy of that 11-second segment of dispatch audio existed somewhere outside the system. She never told me where. She lives in South Carolina now with a garden and 3 grandchildren, and she does not want to talk about the park at all, which I respect completely, and which tells you everything about what those 4 days cost a woman who never once lost her voice in 26 years. Harold Butler died in February of the following year. It was his heart, and it happened in his own kitchen, and it had nothing to do with any of this. He was 63. I went to the service. There were maybe 40 people there, and most of them were mountain families, the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the people who had been carried down off that ridge in the 30s, and I was the only person in that room who had ever worn the uniform of the agency that took their land, and every single one of them shook my hand. His daughter gave me something afterward. It was a folding knife with a bone handle, worn down to almost nothing on the blade from 70 years of sharpening. She said her father had told her, more than once in his last year, that if anything happened to him I was to be given it, and that I would know what for. I did not know what for. It took me until the following October to understand. That is the 4th thing on the plate. That is what I mean when I say one object that belonged to a person who is no longer alive. I carry that knife up the trace every year in the last week of October, and I set it on the stone with the pork and the corn, and I pour the coffee out over the rock, and I sit for a while, and then I take the knife back and I walk down. The knife is the part that is for Harold. The rest is rent. I do not know what is up there. I want to be honest with you at the end of this, because I have spent 8 years listening to people tell me what it must have been, and none of them were on that bench. I do not know if it is one animal or the last of a line. I do not know how it moves the way it moves, or why the thermal did not hold it, or how a thing that size lives that long in a mountain range 2 hours from the capital of a country of 300 million people without ever leaving a body. I have theories, and I have thrown all of them away at least once. Here is the only thing I am sure of. Harold Butler was right about the nature of the arrangement. It was never made with the land, it was made with people, and when the people were removed from that hollow by men with paperwork, nobody thought to ask whether the agreement went with them. Somebody has been paying it for 9 years now. When I retire, that stops, unless I find somebody to hand it to, and I have not yet met the person I could say this to without watching their face change. So if you are ever on that ridge in late October, and the woods go quiet around you the way a room goes quiet when someone walks in, do not whistle. Do not call anybody's name out loud after sundown. And if you hear a voice you know coming out of ground where that voice has no business being, do not answer it, and do not go toward it, and get down out of that hollow while you can still see your own hands. Somebody up there is owed, and it is very old, and it is patient, and it has an extremely long memory. If you made it all the way down out of the hollow with me, hit that like button before you go, because it genuinely helps these stories find the people who need to hear them. Tell me down in the comments whether you would have answered that voice in the fog, because I still do not know if I would have stopped myself without Jordan's hand on my collar. And subscribe, and turn the notifications on, because there are 3 more incidents from that district that I have never written down anywhere but here. And the